Hi everyone and welcome to Beyond Tomorrow, a new series from the New Zealand Herald in partnership with MYOB, where we tackle the unprecedented business environment affecting thousands of small and medium-sized enterprises right across New Zealand as the world battles to slow the spread of the novel coronavirus. I'm Will Trafford, and every day I'm joined by Ingrid Cronin-Knight, MYOB's country manager, and today our guest Brett Gower, a commercial solicitor with Smith Partners. Today we're talking about your business premises, so lease agreements, rent forgiveness, evictions, break clauses, all that kind of thing. Ingrid, for most SMEs, I understand rent is the single largest expense they'll pay after paying their employees?
Yeah, that's right. So we're in a really tricky situation here where you have, people can't get access to the premises right now while we're in alert 4, and then they may be able to get access to it, but they're not getting any revenue coming in apart from potentially some of the government wage subsidy. And so how we negotiate our way through that and get a fair outcome, I think, is going to be a really tricky situation that we need to support our business leaders navigating over the next month and months to come. So really excited to actually have this session to give them some practical tips about what they need to consider.
Well, the obvious thing you'd imagine is businesses unable to pay, I suppose, or refusing to pay. Can you just sort of give us an idea, if you will, Brett, what that means for the business that is looking at their bank account at the moment and going, I'm going to pay my wages, but rent, that I'm not going to be able to make that payment?
Yeah, so a lot of them have those issues come to the fore in this situation. Obviously, cash flow is going to always be there, is going to be a real problem in this situation. They're unable to be using those premises, and their inability to use their premises impacts quite severely on their ability to generate income, and then their cash flow suffers as a result of it. So it's the same thing, and almost universally across the people that we talk with. They may not be prevented entirely from fully conducting their business, but depending on the sort of premises it is, like, for example, retailers are really struggling.
One of the things I like that we were kind of finding across the series essentially is the importance of communication, I suppose. Yesterday we were talking about cash flow. Today, I suppose we're talking more about the communication between landlords and the tenants themselves, right? There's a lot of communication and a lot of negotiation, I guess, involved.
There is. And one of the things that we generally stress with landlords and tenants, even before this issue has arisen, is that communication, having a really good relationship with your tenant or your landlord, is a really key part to making your business successful. It's something that needs to be occurring, not just in these crisis situations.
So I guess before we go into the legal sort of angles, you really want to have these discussions, and I guess the kind of discussions that the information we're going to provide now can inform. I'm interested, Brett, there's a unique situation in New Zealand with regard to rent obligations for small businesses that came in the wake of the Christchurch earthquakes. Is that right?
Yes, there is a provision in the standard Auckland District Law Society lease that is generating a lot of interest and has caused a lot of discussion in the media and in various other places already.
I guess to give people that background, what I've got here is a fair proportion of the rent and outgoings shall cease to be payable for the period commencing on the date when the tenant became unable to gain access to the premises to fully conduct the tenant's business from the premises until that inability ceases. So I guess in the context of Christchurch, that was, lockdowns of buildings because of quake damage and that kind of stuff. This is probably the similarity, right, that we're dealing with now. A lot of people wanting to do business, a lot of people unable, though, to get into the premises.
Yeah, so what happened in Christchurch was that people were the lease provision previously said that if the building was damaged and you couldn't get access, then it would be possible to get a rent abatement. But in Christchurch, there were a lot of premises that weren't damaged, and therefore that clause that they had never kicked in. So there was a situation where it was considered that it wasn't reasonable that because they were being prevented by the emergency from accessing their premises, that they were not able to get that rent abatement. So that's why the the form of the lease was amended.
I guess let's, if we can, then maybe talk about what it could potentially mean, right? This notion of a fair proportion. I've got 50% written here. Does that sound about right to you?
A lot of tenants and landlords are hitting on 50% it's such an arbitrary measure. It really is going to depend on each situation, and because like I was saying earlier, like retailers are struggling to conduct their business at all, but some businesses, for example, a retailer that has an online business, they may not be fully conducting their business, and 50% might be reasonable for them. But for other retailers that don't have an online option, or they don't operate an online business, they might be looking at 70 or 80% because they just really don't get any. They can't conduct their business in any way whatsoever.
If this clause sounds like something that you would be keen to do, if you need to go talk to your landlord, and realistically paying your current rates of rent is not going to be something that you're going to be able to do, how would you do about this? How would you sort of go about this? Would you have to get lawyers involved from day one?
Not necessarily. No, I mean, a lot of our clients deal directly with their landlords, and they've come to us simply to put documents together or like the landlord might come to us to get a document that documents what is essentially a variation of their lease. But like I was saying earlier, it's really important that they have a good relationship with your tenant or your landlord, and there's no reason absolutely why they couldn't negotiate between themselves directly.
On that, I want to bring you in, Ingrid. I wonder if you can, does 50% even sound realistic for most of the kind of businesses that MYOB is interacting with, given this, what is basically a massive sort of restraint of an ability to even trade?
Yeah, look, it really depends on which sector the business is in, and what and the clients that they're serving. I think Brett just talked about, is it reduced demand so they can still service a little bit, or is it completely stopped, which, as we know, for cafes and bars and restaurants, that's the situation that they find themselves in. So I do think it is unique given your demands. And if I think about small business owners, facing these choices around what they have to do, ultimately our desire, because is to get a handle of your cash flow and about where you're at, have the facts in front of you, and then you probably have to estimate some scenarios in the future around, if demand gets, we go down to lockdown 3 and you can then start trading again, what that means, and then therefore where you think your cash flow will be at and when you'll be able to pay it. But I think from a landlord's perspective, some of them are mum and dad investors, and so they will have equally the same sort of cash flow concerns. But what you want to do is, from their perspective, they're trading off potentially, having a good tenant in the short term for, trying to have some flexibility to work your way through the discussion, so that I think everyone's going to lose a little bit in this process. And so if we can come to a fair outcome, I think that's, given the scenarios about where the sectors that your tenants are in, then that's the best outcome possible, I think.
Obviously, we understand that people need to be realistic, and we understand that the economy has basically changed. But what are some of the ways in which you should go and approach this in terms of negotiating?
I think one of the classic kind of negotiation things is not to try and be overly positional about it. That's really important that you set out your position, and that will include what the scenario is going to be at level 3, and if it drags on longer than the current 4 weeks, what's going to be the reality for the business, and being really, I think being transparent with the landlord is going to be really helpful. I don't think there's going to be any advantage in trying to be unreasonably hard about it. I know there have been a lot of stories about people who have just said that we're not paying any rent, and in some situations that makes it really difficult for the landlord to feel like the tenant is being reasonable.
I guess also from the landlord's perspective, there's that need to be realistic as well, right? Because the reality is that the economy has changed. We talked yesterday about 10% of something is better than 100% of nothing, and they might need to consider the ideas around litigation costs and that sort of thing of chasing a business that may well no longer exist.
that's the other thing that we're telling our landlord clients, that they want to make sure that they have tenants at the end of this, because we don't know what is going to happen at the end of it, and it may be very difficult to find another tenant. If you're so harsh on them that they go broke, well, it may work out worse. You may be in a worse position than if you're reasonable about it in the first instance.
I really like your words, Brett, around not starting from a positional perspective where you're trying to campaign, but just starting with actually this is reality, and then seeing if there's a way through it together, and that negotiation. We know that two parties can negotiate in goodwill to have a favourable outcome that works them both, and you are weighing up potentially vacant premises over the longer term, but equally there are some real challenges. Let's say I can't afford, I'm paying my people and I can't afford to pay my rent. And then what happens is I don't pay it and I miss payments. Can you be locked out the moment we move down to the alert level? And what does that actually really look like for businesses?
Once 10 working days has passed and you haven't paid the rent, it allows the landlord to give you a notice that you're in breach of the lease, and in that situation, what happens is that once that period of the notice is then elapses, if you haven't remedied the breach, the landlord has access. They have the ability to take the premises back, and you essentially are out. But I'm not 100% sure how that's going to work in this environment, because I would imagine that if you were served notice and you responded with some kind of reason as to why you were unable to, that was reasonable, then it would be really hard to see how the process is going to play out. I mean, it's going to be tested. You can be sure over the next months there will be a lot of court cases.
Does it look like the courts will be presumably massively overwhelmed by all this? Because a number of small businesses, obviously, that are struggling in this way can't really be understated.
I think what will happen is there'll be a few early cases that set the tone, because there are probably two questions that need to be asked. There's the question about whether the clause is tenable and whether it's going to be reasonable as to what the rent abatement should be. And that will get answered quite quickly, I would imagine. And then there'll be the issue of the people who have leases that don't have that clause. And then how's that going to be played out? And you'll get early decisions around those that will then help people settle, because they'll know the way that the court looks at it.
If the landlord locks the door as a result of the rent being unpaid, who owns the inventory and who owns the plant within that building? And do they have any rights whatsoever to withhold that inventory or any of that plant?
Look, it'll be case specific, but I would have thought that if there are things that are in the building that belong to the tenant that they haven't removed inside the period of notice that they've been given, the landlord will be entitled to just deal with them. It's a tricky kind of area. In most instances, what you get is tenants move out, they take all their stuff with them, and there might be arguments about the fit out, who owns the partitioning or whatever's left in the shelving in the retail store. But stock, things like that, would generally be taken by the tenant.
Just, you mentioned briefly, Brett, that some people might not have that provision in their lease. Is there anything different in your guidance for those that when they go and check out their lease and see what the terms of it are? It sounds like all the new ones will have that provision or that clause in there, but for those that don't, because they might have been on either older commercial contracts, is there anything that they need to consider that's different from what we've already highlighted?
They're in a more difficult position, basically, because there isn't a term of their contract that seems to provide for it. The advice is the same. Talk reasonably with your landlord and try and explain why you need some kind of abatement. And it's going to be the same with landlords that have got that are the landlord in that situation. That again, they're going to need to be reasonable. Otherwise, it's going to be the same situation that they could not have a tenant at the end of it.
this notion which we're saying could potentially be 50%, but also might not be 50%. If the tenant believes that the legal argument around the 50% is solid, or that paying even less is solid, can they do that and prevent the landlord from forcing them to call in the liquidators and that kind of thing? Can they say, look, my argument is that I should only be paying 20%, that's all I'm going to pay, and you can't touch me?
It comes down eventually to what the value of the premises is and how much rent is being paid and whether it's worth taking them to court over. In some situations, I mean, some of the tenants and landlords that we're dealing with, the dollar value is tiny, but on the other extreme, the dollar value can be hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and in that situation, the landlord is not going to walk away from it without a fight. So it will be dependent on what the dollar value of the issue comes down to, because it's not worth taking to court generally.
I guess the last question I've got written there is, let's say you're the landlord and you find yourself in cash flow difficulties where you can't meet your obligations, and so then they've tried and pursued other financing and they can't make it through that hurdle for some reason, so they have their own liquidity event. What does that mean for the rights of tenants? If
the landlord is insolvent and they have a liquidator appointed, that the liquidator would sell the property to somebody who was solvent, and the contractual arrangement would be with the new owner, and the tenant's obligations would be to the new owner. So it doesn't absolve the tenant of their obligation, and what it does is the lease would become an asset that the liquidator would take over and would have something to sell to a new person.
I think the big takeaway for me, Ingrid, I wonder if it's the same for you. We keep talking about this communication, right? If you're a small business in trouble, you need to start talking to people, and I guess you need to start talking very early.
Yeah, I think it's communication and clarity. And the one bit that we don't have is any certainty at the moment. That's the challenge on all of this, is around when does the alert level change? And look, I think we're taking all the right measures, but it just puts in that tricky situation. So at least if you can have good communication and clarity about what you do know, then as much as what you can, then that gives you a good place to really negotiate in good faith with each other. And that's what we're going to see as business owners try to navigate their way through this.
I suppose both of you agree with the general rule of thumb, which is contact your advisors, talk to someone to figure out where to go next.
Yes, actually, that's what I was going to say. So one of the things that we are telling people is that they have responsibilities to mitigate their loss if they've got a loss. So they're responsible for taking all the steps that they need to, and that includes talking to their advisors, but taking advantage of all of the packages that are out there, talking to their banks, talking to their insurers, making sure that they understand their position really clearly.
And we'd endorse, getting the right advice for business owners. Like these guys are really courageous, and they'll need to be more brave than ever in these challenging scenarios. But getting an advisor that in the right area, whether it be, in this situation, a legal advice to help you with this, or your accountants, or, an HR advisor to help you through the employment negotiations that you might need to go through. It's critical that you have someone in your corner that's giving you a better view than what you might have.
All right, team, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much. We want your questions. Tomorrow we're talking about taxes, government stimulus packages, PAYE, GST leniency, all that sort of thing. You can email your questions to video@nzherald.co.nz. I'm Will Trafford. Thanks, team. Bye for now.